Okay, welcome back if you caught our earlier panels. This is the third session of our conference, the sixth Lemkin reunion titled Values in Retreat. Is the resurgence of transactional foreign policy hindering the prevention of mass atrocities, the promotion of the rule of law, and the global response to COVID-19? From Budapest, I'm Ben Witorsh, Holbrook Fellow at the Shattuck Center on Conflict, Negotiation, and Recovery at Central European University School of Public Policy. Each year, the Shattuck Center hosts the Lemkin Reunion, a gathering established in 2014 with the generous support of an anonymous donor. The reunion is named in honor of Raphael Lemkin, the Polish lawyer who, having lost most of his family in the Holocaust, coined the term genocide and then campaigned tirelessly throughout his life to have it codified as an international crime. So far, we've discussed the impact of transaction-based foreign policy on the international system and the prevention of and accountability for mass atrocities. Now we turn to rule of law and democratic backsliding, a term you may have heard a lot of lately. According to the Journal of Democracy, democratic backsliding is the state-led debilitation or elimination of the political institutions sustaining an existing democracy. Many observers say democratic backsliding is happening before our eyes in a number of countries that were once believed to be solid, if not mature democracies. In line with the theme of our event today, our extremely knowledgeable panel will examine whether certain examples of democratic backsliding are impacted, accelerated, or even the result of the transactional trend in foreign policy. And it's important to look at democratic backsliding because mass atrocities are more likely to occur or be committed by non-democratic states. One technical note for today's session: please submit your questions using the link to menti.com and the instructions that you see below your screen. Now I'd like to introduce our panel chair who leads an organization that observes and sounds the alarm bell when it perceives threat to basic rights or the rule of law. Márta Pardavi is co-chair of the Hungarian Helsinki Committee. She also serves and has served on a number of national and international boards of organizations dealing with a range of human rights issues. She holds a law degree from Eötvös Loránd University in Budapest. And in 2018, she received the William D. Zabel Human Rights Defender of the Year Award, and in 2019 was named to Politico's list of the 28 people shaping, shaking, and stirring Europe. Márta, the panel is yours.
Thank you, Ben. Welcome, everybody. A warm welcome from Budapest. We've just had a very, very severe thunderstorm, but the sun is clearing, the sky is clearing, the sun's coming out, and I hope you all have a wonderful morning or afternoon, evening, wherever you are. This is a truly global panel, and I'm very happy to welcome our panelists and also the audience. As Ben said, if you're watching us on YouTube, you can also send us questions on the Menti app. You see the link to that on your screen, and I will be happy to raise your questions later on after the panelists' remarks. I know many of our panelists, and it's a great pleasure to welcome them, and also it's great to meet Fernan, who I don't know. I'm quite interested in their take on how the relationships imperiled democracies have with the international community factor into the actions they take domestically that threaten the rule of law. This is a global issue, but it's a very real one. And from my perspective, working at a human rights NGO in Hungary, I can tell you that this is truly important. We do perceive a difference in how governments act when, for whatever reason, the international community, and particularly Western democracies, place lesser emphasis on the state of democracy and rule of law. This happens in Hungary, and this happens elsewhere too. And it's not only domestically that we experience threats to the rule of law in our own setting here in Budapest and in Hungary, but also we see how our own government, with its increasingly transactional foreign policy is also eroding the rights-based multilateral order. This is clear when one looks at the examples of the Hungarian government's human rights voting record in the European Union, in the Council of Europe, or at the UN. Just to give you a couple of examples, but I think they're quite pertinent. When it comes to the EU's foreign policy, for example, at times joint EU action relating to very grave human rights violations in, for example, Egypt or China has run into difficulty because of the Hungarian government's reluctance to support a common position. Hungary, also as a large recipient of Chinese investment, has repeatedly blocked EU statements criticizing China's human rights record. And just a year ago, the parliamentarians representing Hungary's dominant party, Fidesz, in the Council of Europe Parliamentary Assembly voted against calling on the law enforcement authorities in Malta to carry out an independent public inquiry into the killing of the journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia. I was also very struck when last summer, about a year ago, Hungary broke away from the other EU member states on the UN Human Rights Council and voted against examining extrajudicial killings in the Philippines. This is some examples from real life, but there is an underlying theory and underlying currents that allow this to happen. And this is what this panel will be addressing. And I will introduce the speakers at length, a little length, before they make their introductions and their interventions. And now I'd like to turn to the first speaker, who will be Wojciech Przybylski, who will deliver his presentation. Hello. Our colleague is from Poland, and he's the editor-in-chief of Visegrad Insight, which is a great news source if you want to follow this region. And he's also the president of the board of the Respublika Foundation. His expertise includes European politics and also political culture. And today, Wojciech will be speaking about something that is interesting to us all, how the future of Central Europe could be developing. So he'll be talking about Central European futures, the end of the post-Cold War era of democratic reform, socio-economic development, and Western integration. Welcome, Wojciech, and you're invited to make your remarks.
Thank you, Márta. Real pleasure, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me. I was indeed asked to actually refer to the presentation we have had last year, a presentation of the report, Central European Future Scenarios for Central Europe. That's a report, I would say, a unique product that continues to help shape the debate, or map the debate at least, on the future of Central Europe and Europe overall. You can cross out Central, you can start with Europe. And it's an effort, it's a collective effort of many great minds and analysts. Here in our group also, Péter, Krekó included, from Central Europe, from different backgrounds, think tankers, business people, and so on, who joined, and journalists, who joined together with us and the German Marshall Fund, with whom we prepared the report. I just self-promotion, that's the report, and you can download it. And with such beautiful illustrative material, I actually put it on the wall of my kitchen back there. It's a report that aims to stimulate the debate. So I'm very happy to be able to open today's remark. But first, before I speak on the report, I wanted to make maybe 3 points indeed to kind of make a contact with the theme of Lemkin reunion and today's panel. So first, we're talking, and I heard in the opening remarks of yesterday, of the opening panel, many references to Francis Fukuyama, as if Francis Fukuyama was kind of the only frame of reference. Indeed, very important for us, and I think I'll also make some references to him. But before, I would prefer to speak on Tony Judd's post-war. What we're actually facing today is a situation that's actually now 2 generations have never experienced before, which is the end of a particular moment in time in Europe, for Europe, but not only for the world perhaps, which is the end of the post-war era. Post-war is the book by Tony Judd, with many implications and description on how the setting of the world, Europe, transatlantic relations looked like, how the politics was shaped, including the 20th century version of liberalism, that I think is very important, and realizing that there's a certain age, certain time period, which also ends or is about to end, which is by Tony Judd post-war, we can also call it differently, is of key importance, because that helps us understand that some of things we take for granted are also historical beings. Not to say they have to end, not to say that they're not to be, they cannot be revived, or they're not to be, that there is some fatum and fatalism. But if people don't do anything about it, most likely they're going to end. And liberalism in liberal democracy is one of them. It's a historical phenomena. It has begun at some point, and it's undergoing several processes, and there are several trends, global trends, which may lead to its end. The question is how, if not postponing that, if not completely, eliminating that possibility, how do you at least postpone it? A conservative point of view, you would say, and how do you do that in a collective field? I couldn't imagine a better opportunity to speak on this than in a discussion on transactionalism in foreign policy. And as you referred earlier, the questions of how domestic democratic setting is interlinked with foreign policy and international relations. And I find this topic in particular fascinating, especially that it's not new. It was actually a debate at the beginning of the 20th century for the US. For the US, there was a strong emerging intellectual current at that time called later American political realism, that we know from Kissinger, earlier from Morgenthau. But it all started with the questions on morals and how the setting of the internal ethical standard of within the country is set up with a lot of theological actually discussion by Reinhold Niebuhr at that time. Okay, here were my remarks. I hope they're linking at least or bringing something new to the discussion as points where we can anchor to them later. But now speaking on specific topic of Central Europe, I would not see so much of transactionalism. I see much more of chaotic hypocrisy. I also wrote on that earlier. I can refer to that in the discussion. There isn't so much of a transactionalism in the mindset of leaders who we call illiberal leaders of today's Central Europe. It's much more of chaotic hypocrisy, a lot of gambling, and a very little of a plan or even a clear definition apparently in their own mindset of what national interest would be. So hard to say there is any transactionalism in what they do. Even that, not to say that I'm in favor of transactionalism. Now to the report, several quick points. I guess I have 5 minutes to do that, and I'll do it I'll try to put it all in a nutshell. The report that I'm referring, and basically the question which we're facing is again, whether the period the Central Europe entered in 1989 is like is a slope that goes forever up and we can only become more graduate, or is it at a critical juncture? And the report actually starts with an assumption that indeed Central Europe and Europe is at a critical juncture because of global processes that I'm gonna list now quickly. And then from those processes and trends that are specifically pronounced in Central Europe, different patterns, different scenarios may emerge. These are ideal types. These are just for the purpose of the discussion. They will never materialize in full as we will speak. But the outlining of those, this intellectual map helps to shape discussion, as I mentioned earlier. So graduate democracies, as we're facing all around the world the process of ending of liberal certainty. And the spread of liberalism is definitely not on the agenda. And for the last 30 years or so, this was the game in town, a global town, global village. We all believed that spread of liberalism, democracy, and the certainty that was accumulated there with everyone, no matter if someone liked liberalism or not, is fading away. And it's so much more about convictions of liberalism progress than the facts and figures that it has an effect. That very fact of fading away or faltering certainty is of great repercussion for the region and Europe overall. Secondly, we are facing resurgent nationalism. Again, around the world, it's not only Central Europe, but it is specifically pronounced and visible in Central Europe that challenges any transnational, multinational project like European Union itself, but not only, again, around the world, no matter where we look. The economic model that we have seen is also challenged by at least two factors, and I don't mean pandemic here. There is a larger scale of events. First, changing demography. Secondly, changing technology. I mean, we're talking already about how demography distribution around the world is changing. There are uneven patterns of demography changes in Europe, in the United States. When you compare it to Africa, when you compare it to Asia, with that comes the workforce, work being the source of prosperity for all these countries. That has tremendous effects. Fourth, the key multilateral institutions, EU, NATO, but also UN, are facing a very difficult moment. Not to say that they are in crisis. We can discuss how much of a crisis it is. Actually, I think EU, well, let's see, but EU has demonstrated that it could overcome just a very few recent crises like Brexit, much to the surprise of many. And so this is not irreversible, but the crisis is there. And finally, there is this geopolitics, the notion of geopolitics is coming back after 30 years. I don't know what geopolitics is really. We can discuss that, but Russians certainly do. They use this. There is a strong notion and reference to geopolitics, the determinism or determination by geopolitics, and I believe with that comes a lot of this transactionalism that you can trade cards on a board game of the global map of power. So all of this have a lot of impact on Central Europe, and I'll just list 5 scenarios that emerge, and I'll stop because I think the time is up. Out of it, 5 scenarios that were mapped and nicely narrated, but just 1 page only. So I encourage to read anyone who wants. It's a short report. It's not one of those longer versions. One scenario is triumph of liberalism. So Central European illiberal models, which I don't believe they're much of a model. They're more of a tag to something that someone cannot perform. People often think that autocratic or illiberal leaders are so witty. I tend, and actually the report shows that they're not. They're actually unable, incapable, and somehow faulty in their own personal design to embrace and implement democratic standards. Democracy is something more advanced. So illiberalism is just a cover-up name for a mess they create, as I called it, chaotic hypocrisy. And a brand, of course, they also try to put in something new, like New Christian Democracy or whatever, but it's basically a cover-up name for something which is not a graduate democracy, faulty democracy, imperfect and full of fractures. And this model, if is spread across Europe, that changes the situation of Central Europe profoundly. Second scenario refers to Central Europe fractured, where some countries go this direction, but some other don't. Let's see. Actually, we're at a critical moment in Poland, where the presidential election next Sunday will determine very much the future of this country. And there are likely chances, you can see by the number of votes, the predictions are neck to neck for both candidates, that the one of the candidates would definitely, with a high impact of Polish president on foreign policy and security policy, could reverse the trends that are observable in Poland. The first scenario is shotgun wedding because of a crisis situation. Welcome to the post-COVID-19 crisis, economic crisis. European Union again comes up with a new plan. There we go, we have some sort of a plan that will, without change of hearts, change minds of Central Europeans to integrate more and to embrace the standards and institutional setting that European Union is committed to. Fourth scenario, kind of more optimistic, but perhaps too much of a wishful thinking, is Central European Spring 2.0, speaks of a generational change, a generation that's often demonstrated itself as also committed to nationalism and all these resurging ideas of the past. But in its other side, it's also full of optimism and embracement of technology and technological culture, and so much different to those old-timers who are unable to grasp the zeitgeist, and then they retreat to some sort of illiberalism or backsliding. And finally, fifth scenario, security vacuum. A question which may be also a point for discussion later. Security vacuum is a scenario in which we see that disbelief in the security guarantees by EU and NATO. NATO is the hard part of security for the region, but EU is no less a guarantor of security for the region, security from foreign interference and dominance, lead the political leadership in particular countries different strategies to bring security to the region. Today's leadership in Poland thinks only US can provide security. Well, there you go. We had all of that. Today's leadership in Hungary believes it's radical multilateral or radical unilateralism in multi-vectors. So they speak with China, Russia, Turkey, but also US, also EU, seeking guarantees in a way from totally different actors and disregarding the official institutions they belong to. See at the conflict with Ukraine, conflicting not only with Ukraine, but also with other NATO members and EU over the security arrangement in the region. So these are 5 scenarios. I'm happy to discuss later on, answer questions or get involved in comments. Sorry for taking a bit of much time.
Thank you, Wojciech. All of these scenarios are really interesting when I read them a year ago, and it's interesting to see how things are evolving and which scenario will come closer to what reality is. Now, I'd like to introduce our second speaker, and he is Daniel Kelemen, who is a professor of political science and law and a Jean Monnet chair in European Union politics at Rutgers University, and I believe he's now physically in Philadelphia. He focuses on the politics of the European Union, law and politics, and comparative political economy. And now he will talk about something that is very often quoted now. It's the authoritarian equilibrium in the European Union. Dan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Márta. Yeah, and I'm going to connect my talk to some of the research I've done on what's called the authoritarian equilibrium, but I want to frame it in terms of the theme of this conference and transactionalism. And just to clarify terms, the way I'm using it, like I think most of us, really what I have in mind with transactionalism in foreign policy is when democratic regimes pursue foreign policies that betray their stated principles, such as the promotion of democracy, fundamental rights, rule of law, in the name of either financial or commercial gain or just political expediency and sort of realpolitik, right? One of my favorite encapsulations of that kind of ethos is it's a quote often attributed to FDR, but some people think it's apocryphal, when he was speaking about the Nicaraguan dictator Somoza. You may have all heard this quote, right? He may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch, right? And we'll see that that kind of ethos comes back into play, you know, within the EU and within its political parties. So yeah, as we all know, over the past decade, there's been a global wave of democratic backsliding, what Larry Diamond's called the democratic recession. This has affected dozens of countries around the world. But what has been perhaps most striking for many of us, and certainly for people like me who, and most of us, not all, but most of us on this panel who study sort of European politics, is, you know, this has occurred within the European Union as well, which professes to be a union of democracies committed to promoting democracy, rule of law, human rights. So that makes it extra puzzling that, you know, that backsliding would you know, go on within a union like the EU. And, you know, within the EU, the cases that are sort of best known, most egregious are Hungary and Poland. And those, I think, are the most advanced backsliders. In the case of Hungary, it's already a hybrid authoritarian regime, but they are by no means the only ones. And there's other states, of course, experiencing backsliding as well. So yeah, I want to talk about how transactional approaches sort of encourage that democratic backsliding, relating it to the research I've done on the authoritarian equilibrium. But then I'm also going to say something at the end about how this kind of relates to transactional approaches to foreign policy more broadly, sort of the EU on the global stage. So just quickly, so I've talked a lot about the role of party politics in sustaining autocracies within the EU and the role of the Euro parties. And essentially what we have there is that the kind of half-baked Euro parties like the European People's Party, the Party of Democrats and Socialists, the liberal group ALDE, they tend to support what I call pet autocrats. So within their groups, they may have a democratic backslider, right, who's a member of their party, and yet they protect these regimes and defend them even while they engage in backsliding. The most infamous example of this is the European People's Party and its relationship with Orban, who famously is still in the European People's Party and the EPP group in the European Parliament. But yeah, ALDE has Babiš, the Socialists have their Romanian member party, the Maltese kleptocracy, they're in the Socialist Party, ECR, well, they don't really stand for democracy much anyway, but they have Kaczynski and the Peace. And of course, when the UK was still in, then you had the Tories, which were in the ECR as a big defender of peace, right? So this goes on, across the board. And what is the transactionalism? Well, what is the transaction here? It's a simple transaction. Your autocratic party votes for us in the European Parliament, and in exchange, we defend you against EU censure. That's the transaction. And also you'll try to vote with us usually in the council and other places, but a lot of the actions in the parliament. And I would just say in closing on this, that this is a common transaction in sort of federal and federal type systems around the world. Here in America, we had this transaction. So this is bad news for my friends in the EU. We had it for 100 years nearly, right? Where the Democratic Party protected Southern Democrats who ran one-party autocratic regimes that systematically disenfranchised and oppressed their African-American citizens, right, in exchange for votes in Congress and help electing Democratic presidents, right? So this can go on for a long time. Second transaction, leave aside parties, is a financial transactions involving EU funding. The EU, again, which purports to be a defender of democracy, is a huge funder of democratic backsliding and even of autocracy. Member states that are the largest beneficiaries of EU funding, for them, the amounts can be massive. 4% of GDP per annum they're getting in free money from the EU in transfers. And some of the biggest recipients are the biggest backsliders, right? So countries like Hungary is the biggest on a per capita basis, Poland the biggest overall, other backsliders like Bulgaria, huge recipients. And what's the nature of the transaction? Well, the transaction is the EU gives the autocrat or kleptocrat, backslider, give them money. And in exchange, the autocrat or kleptocrat won't disrupt the functioning of the EU too much or veto initiatives that are important to the net contributors. And by the way, we're about to see that go down, I would predict, on the bailout scheme for Corona response, right? Where, the Germans, other net contributors, they have other bigger fish to fry. And I think they're going to let the rule of law stuff slide, basically, in exchange for getting through their bailout package. But that, that's the nature of the transaction. And by the way, it happens, both for structural funds, but also for ag funds. And, I'm sure most people here, but if you haven't read the incredible expose by the New York Times on the money farmers, right, read it. Great quote in there. EU leaders disagree about many things, but they all count on generous subsidies from the EU and wide discretion in spending them. Right. So, all right. Next transaction. I got a couple minutes left, don't I, Márta? Right. Yeah.
Yes.
Next transaction involves foreign direct investment. Okay, FDI. I often like to say Hungary is not an autocracy, but an Audiocracy. Although that's a bit unfair on Audi because it's also BMW, right? But in the 90s and 2000s, a lot of people thought, well, as states democratize and strengthen rule of law, they'll attract more FDI. That foreign investment will encourage them to remain democracies. But in research I've been conducting with Julia Gray and Terence Teo, two colleagues of mine, political economists, we're finding that really as states backslide, they don't lose FDI at all. In fact, in the past decade, right? There's no relationship between backsliding and loss of FDI. And, we see this, within the EU where, let's say in Hungary, for instance, they had higher inflows of FDI in 2017, 7 years into the Orban backsliding, than they did in 2010 when he started. And there's many examples of this. And, I would say the nature of the transaction there is an interesting one. It's essentially, our firms will provide you FDI, right? That underpins your economy in many cases. And in exchange, you won't expropriate our firms. And while you engage in attacks on the rule of law and democratic backsliding, you won't extend that to basically, disadvantaging or harming our multinationals. So you may expropriate small and medium-sized enterprises in your countries for your crony capitalism, but when it comes to the big multinationals, you'll give them, the red carpet treatment, and also provide them with sort of a tax-friendly, low-wage workforce, et cetera. All right. Let's see. I wasn't paying much attention time, but I'll try to close off. There's a bit of a transaction involving emigration. I'll save that for the Q&A, but I could talk more about the role of emigration in sustaining these regimes where dissatisfied voters leave these countries in droves and become low-wage workers in the host countries that they immigrate to. But I won't go into that right now for reasons of time. I guess I just want to move on to close and say something about how these internal dynamics relate to transactionalism of the EU and foreign policy more generally on the world stage. And what I'd say there is that, yeah, there's strong connections between those internal transactional dynamics I described and the external ones. Because in essence, it's harder to maintain internal democratic standards and commitments if you're engaged in transactional foreign policy with blatantly autocratic or dictatorial regimes like China and Russia. We heard about this already a bit, in other talks. And, in essence, I mean, think about like the car factory examples I was just mentioning. Can anyone really criticize, car companies for building big factories in East European backsliders when they're doing the exact same thing in China, which has concentration camps for Uyghurs, right? Because we've lowered their standards so much. So, governments, I think, would be loath to kind of criticize their multinationals or discourage them from investing in hybrid autocracies at the same moment that they're encouraging them to invest in blatant dictatorships, right? So those two become linked. And then also, the EU loses credibility to fight backsliding internationally when it's not fighting it at home. How can the EU promote democracy and fight backsliding around the world when it doesn't even do it at home, right? And then finally, the other link, I think, is with this Trojan horse phenomena, where these backsliders within the EU, they start to use their position inside the EU to kind of act as and market themselves as Trojan horses for more blatantly hostile autocracies like Russia and China, right? And So that was already mentioned that, Hungary's been playing that role. Márta, you talked about that. And, I think that exposes, a vulnerability in the EU in any effort to craft a sort of more principled foreign policy, that these autocrats within can act as Trojan horses and spoilers. All right, but I'll stop there. I've taken too much time, and thanks very much.
Thank you, Dan, for these very interesting comments. Little, certainly sometimes provocative, so that we keep our attention on this panel. And now, zooming out, though, from Central Europe and Europe in general, we're going to look at a different issue, but very connected. And so here to bring a broader, more global perspective to our panel is our colleague Fernan Talamayan, and he's in Taiwan now, in north of Taiwan in Hsinchu City. He holds a master's degree from Central European University and also from the University of Philippines, Diliman. And he's currently pursuing his Ph.D. at the National Chiao University in Taiwan. Warm welcome from Budapest, Fernan. I invite you to discuss how the Beijing-Manila relationship impacts the state of democracy and the rule of law in the Philippines.
Thank you, Márta. Good afternoon, good evening to Filipinos who are listening now. I think there are some Filipinos who are watching me and watching this panel today. And allow me to share my screen too. I prepared a presentation for this meeting. Wait. There you go. Okay, so I hope it's working fine. So good afternoon, good evening. I'm Fernan and I'm from the Philippines, but I'm now doing my doctoral studies here in Taiwan. I want to begin by thanking my good friend Hakam, who invited me to present my ongoing research about the Beijing-Manila relations at the 6th Lemkin reunion. And I'm also grateful to the Shattuck Center for giving me the opportunity to share the floor with remarkable people. For 10 minutes, I will try my best to share as much as I can about the Philippines' current situation. In particular, I want to focus on the Beijing-Manila relationship and how it impacts the state of democracy and rule of law in the Philippines. So first, in posing this question, I do not intend to create a false causation. It must be noted that even before Manila's inclusion in Beijing's political and economic orbit, the country was already experiencing democratic erosion. The situation was only punctuated by Duterte's assumption of the presidential seat. Human Rights Watch reported that since taking office on June 30, 2016, Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte has carried out a war on drugs, which has led to thousands of deaths, mostly urban poor. Duterte's drug war has instigated fear directed towards his political enemies, as anyone could be easily branded as drug dealers or drug users. The democracy in the Philippines has further become an illusion, as political enemies were either silenced or jailed, as was the case of the famous Philippine senators Leila de Lima and Antonio Trillanes III. These senators were known as loud critics of Duterte and were later imprisoned for being allegedly linked to the country's large-scale drug trade. Political opposition has also been diminished drastically, as most politicians who were former members of opposing parties have declared allegiance to Duterte by officially jumping ship, joining Duterte and his daughter's political party, the Hugpong ng Pagbabago, which roughly translated as the Faction for Change. Meanwhile, fear is further amplified by implementing regulatory policies and strategies that may target dissenters within the population. For instance, there were reports that authorities planted incriminating evidence, such as drugs, to justify their unlawful actions during police raids. With all that said, you might be wondering, where do I situate China in its flourishing relations with the Philippines in this Duterte-sponsored chaos? Despite these issues being domestic, I argue that China has been instrumental in sustaining Duterte's autocratic rule. Although it is challenging to find sources that tell direct Chinese interventions in the practice of democracy in the Philippines, China in recent years has become a major source of ideational and material support for autocracies and liberal leaders in South and Southeast Asia. In the Philippines, Duterte supporters express admiration for authoritarian governance model. Observing the democratic backsliding in the Indo-Pacific region, Aurel Quason of University of Heidelberg noted, and I quote, although not a direct cause of democratic decline, the apparently growing influence of China and its governing model throughout the Indo-Pacific is increasingly affecting the domestic politics of both democratic and authoritarian countries in the region, end of quote. Further, as China presents itself as an alternative source of economic, military, and diplomatic support for governments, impunity and violence became more rampant in the Philippines as Duterte no longer owes his political survival to the West. Quoting Jose Custodio, an independent security analyst, and I quote, under pressure from the West over his human rights record, China has become Duterte's bread and butter, end of quote. It would be remembered that in 2018, Duterte and Xi signed a memorandum of understanding, which included, among others, plans for joint oil and gas exploration in Philippine seas or in South China Sea, a commitment to China's Belt and Road Initiative, and infrastructure cooperation between the two nations through concessional loans to support Duterte's key infrastructure projects. So, by aligning Manila with Beijing, Duterte acquired Chinese aid, which he hoped would help usher a golden infrastructure age in the Philippines, a dream that will find realization through his regime's Build, Build, Build project. And by aligning with Beijing, Duterte no longer had to worry about the economic cost of his human rights record. I want to share a few experiences in the Philippines that reflect the decline of democracy in the country. In a working paper I recently published, I found several violations of human rights in Duterte's Chinese-funded infrastructure flagship projects. For the sake of development, these projects encroach ancestral lands and ultimately threatened indigenous people's existence. Quoting the Philippine president as he promoted the China-funded Centennial water source Kaliwa Dam, and I quote, "Let me be very clear to the citizens. You have every right to protest if it places your lives in jeopardy. But if the safeguards are there between your concerns and the water crisis that you're trying to avoid, I will use extraordinary powers of the presidency." End of quote. Meanwhile, leading players in the Philippine media industry are currently suffering from political attacks and systematic intimidations. ABS-CBN, the largest media conglomerate in the country, has been told to shut down its TV and radio broadcast. Journalist Maria Ressa, the 2018 Time Person of the Year and the CEO of the online news platform Rappler, has been unjustly charged with cyber libel by the political allies of Duterte. The Philippine Daily Inquirer, the country's largest newspaper, also experienced similar harassment in the past. Duterte and his supporters have been very keen and consistent in criticizing these companies, accusing them of, and I quote, unfair coverage, liberal bias, tax evasion, and even swindling. On several occasions, they have also been ironically branded by Duterte supporters as propagandists, peddlers of fake news, or dilawan, or which means yellows. It's a polarizing term they use to associate dissenters with the political party of the former President Benigno Aquino III. So, as Richard Heydarian, a Filipino political scientist, observed, all three media networks have prominently featured news and commentary critical of Duterte's war on drugs, his China-leaning foreign policy, and authoritarian brand of populism. More so, the COVID-19 pandemic has even amplified the democratic backsliding in the country. At the onset of the pandemic, Duterte was given nearly limitless emergency powers. In April, he ordered to kill quarantine violators amid coronavirus chaos. After putting the country in highly militarized lockdown, he said in an impromptu national address, and I quote, My orders to the police and military: if there is trouble or the situation arises where your life is on the line, shoot them dead. End of quote. So this speech was delivered following weeks of criticism of the government's handling of the coronavirus pandemic. People earlier criticized Duterte's hesitance to ban flights from China when the outbreak started. Of course, Duterte at that time was more fearful of the political implications of banning flights from China than the virus. The extreme lockdown in the country has prevented people from leaving their homes and kept dissenters and critics at bay. Activists who refused to be silenced by the government were detained and harassed by the authorities. So to end, I propose that an analysis of the Beijing-Manila relationship can establish the correlation between China's readiness to provide alternative sources of economic, military, and diplomatic support, and the decreasing cost of authoritarian abuse in the Philippines. Quoting Poisson again, China mitigates the potential impact of punitive action by democratic governments in the West. So with that, I end my presentation. Thank you for your time and thanks for listening.
Thank you, Fernan. Now, we'll see how, although this is a highly disturbing account of what is going on in the Philippines, and it's frightening a little bit to listen to this. But even if we are, thousands of kilometers away from each other, I think there's quite a lot of not only similarities in the trends, but also solidarity. And now we move to our last speaker of the panel, Péter Krekó. And Péter will be looking at something that is a little bit similar, I think, because just coming from a different geographic angle. Péter is a professor of sociology at the Eötvös Loránd University here in Budapest, and he's also the executive director of Political Capital, which is a think tank here in Budapest. He focuses on quite a lot of issues on Russian policies and political populism, extremism in Europe, and also a lot on conspiracy theories and disinformation. And today he will be talking about Hungary's eastward drift. Péter, you're invited to take the floor.
Thanks a lot, Márta, for the introduction, and I'm really happy to be in this panel with good friends and in a really good company. And thanks for John Shattuck Center and even to Ben Batoche for inviting me. Pieces of my bread were already eaten up by Márta and Dan in their inputs, but I can at least focus on probably my own thoughts. And yeah, I will return to Hungary. I think we need sometimes this global perspective that we could just see in Central Eastern Europe, because Central Eastern Europeans have the tendency to think that their region is the worst in the world. And unfortunately, there are way worse countries and regions, and Philippines is an important example in this respect. What I'm going to talk about is transactionalism in Hungarian foreign policy. And I do think that the whole concept of the conference is a very important one, and especially if we analyze Hungarian foreign policy, I think this notion of transactionalism comes as something extremely important. Why? Because there are a lot of simplifying narratives on, for example, that Orbán is an ideologue, a fanatic that wants to implement an ideological vision, or even that he wants to be a pro-Eastern dictator. But I think these interpretations are rather losing the point, and the point is transactionalism is a very important tool in the hands of Viktor Orbán and leaders of foreign policy, not just to extend their international influence, but also to strengthen their own regime and to export the political model as well. I would have a very slight disagreement with Wojciech, which is a rare point. I think that there is something like transactionalism in Central Eastern Europe, or at least in Hungary, we can clearly observe that. And wish it were only chaotic hypocrisy, because if it were more chaotic, then it would be less efficient. But what we can observe, I think, for example, in Hungary, is I think a very efficient foreign policy model. If we just take a look at the fact that Viktor Orbán only in the last year could manage to meet on a bilateral level, not just with Xi Jinping or Putin or Erdogan, but also with Donald Trump, with Emmanuel Macron, with Chancellor Merkel, and the list goes on and on. So Hungary clearly punches above its weight in foreign policy, and where there is this wishful thinking in Hungarian left-wing liberal circles that, Hungary have put itself into a diplomatic quarantine. We clearly cannot really see that if we take a look at the big picture. And why I think transactionalism is important, because of what Wojciech mentioned as well, the return of geopolitics, as Walter Russell Mead named it, and also the end of, or the revolution against the imitation, as Ivan Krastev liked to mention it. So an emerging narrative in Central Eastern Europe that the West is finally turned out to be not the Panglossian word, the ideal word that we have to just get closer and closer to, but there is a fine balance between the East and West, and this rising imagery of autonomous foreign policy and third way foreign policy. It's something I think that is very important. If we talk about transactionalism, we should even define that, and I'm pretty sure that there have been quite a lot of definitions brought up. I would use one by Turkish scholars, Bashirov and Yilmaz, who analyzed the Erdogan regime and its transactionalist foreign policy. And I think how they described transactionalism pretty well fits to the Hungarian foreign policy. They define transactionalism as a foreign policy approach that favors bilateral to multilateral relations, that focuses on short-term rather than long-term strategic foresight, adheres to a zero-sum worldview where all gains are relative and reciprocity is absent, and rejects a value-based policy making. Something that Dan Kelemen already mentioned. Also, they define transactionalism as a foreign policy that does not follow a grand strategy. Of course, there is a grand strategy to make the country great again in terms of its foreign policy, but not necessarily always following the same routes. As I said, this third way politics is more and more an obsession of the Hungarian foreign policy, leaders of Hungarian foreign policy. And what we can see usually is that if Orbán goes to the West, to Germany, for example, what does he say to German investors? If you do not invest enough in Hungary, we will go to China and ask for investment from there pretty openly. If we go to the Turkey Council, what does he say there? Join me and I can help you to get closer to the European Union, for Turkey and for Azerbaijan, for example. If he goes to Russia, he sends a message to the West that I have friends there. If he goes to the West, then everybody should see in the East that, okay, this is a country that is well embedded into the Euro-Atlantic institutional setting. And so this kind of approach, I think, makes Orbán's foreign policy much more similar to, let's say, Josip Broz Tito's Yugoslavia, or even more, Nicolae Ceausescu's Romania, in the Western camp than any I think, current models that we can observe. But what we can clearly say is that Orbán does not want to be, let's say, only a puppet of Chinese, Russian interest. And despite the fact that he's playing the freedom fighter, he always pays a fair share to the superpowers. The German companies, as Dan already mentioned, that are receiving quite a lot of privileges in their investments in Hungary and are treated as sacred cows. Russia receives good energy deals. China receives good infrastructure projects. United States receives defense and cooperation agreement and some hopes and promises for weapon acquisition. So Orban plays the freedom fighter, but I think under the table, he tries to create this fine balance. And this is, I think, one of the important secrets of the stability of its regime. And why human rights are important? Because human rights and democratic backsliding are becoming assets in this transactional foreign policy. So not also in the way that Dan already told that, but democratic backsliding has its value on its own because it makes your system a bit more stable, at least on the middle run. And you can put it in the
it seems like Peter's connection is down, but let's hope he gets back online. And in the meantime, I'm eagerly watching to see if his screen is back up. But in the meantime, until he comes back to us, I want to thank the presentations and our speakers. And thank you also our audience who've been sending us questions. There's quite a lot of questions that have arrived, and some of them are really interesting, and I could ask everybody to come in. Some of the other questions have been specifically pointed at one or another speaker. But perhaps let's try to carry on at the point where Peter left off, and let's hope he gets back so that he can maybe jump into the conversation. There's a question regarding foreign direct investment, and the question is very interesting. It reads, regarding foreign direct investment, companies are competitive, profit-seeking entities, and people prefer cheaper products. So there's transaction. Can we also demand that companies become political animals and only invest regimes we approve of? Who would like to answer this? It's quite a big question, but I'm sure everybody has an idea. Yes, Dan, please go ahead.
I'll say something about that, and it might not be a satisfactory answer. But I guess I'm certainly someone who's always a little bit skeptical of the sort of efforts and claims of businesses to only engage in kind of ethical investment practices and that sort of thing. I think they just need to follow the law, right? But so I'm not saying that we can expect them not to invest where it's profitable. That's not what I'm saying. But I think from the government side, I think we have to have a realistic view about what happens here, because there was so much of an assumption. If we go back to, let's say, the 1990s and heydays of globalization, this idea that, well, if we invest in these, authoritarian regimes, that will help open them up. This was the line on China, of course, liberalize their economies. Eventually, you'll liberalize their politics, et cetera. Well, obviously, that didn't happen. And instead, what we're seeing is it's just the reverse. So this is the consequence where the greater economic engagement exposes us to their practices and their policies. So, you have things like in the US where, let's say, the NBA silencing coaches and players who are criticizing China for its crackdown on Hong Kong or that sort of thing because they're worried about their profits there, right? And that's just one example, but you have many, right? And so I think we have to realize that these if the Western firms and firms from democratic countries get heavily invested in these authoritarian regimes, then they're going to basically start importing some of the pressure from those regimes back into the setting of the democratic country, while all they're really doing is propping up those regimes and their economies rather than pressing them to democratize.
So thank you, Dan. Anybody would like to come in? And also welcome back to Péter, Krekó.
Hi, sorry for the dramatic leave.
But you're back. So Wojciech, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. So a couple, I don't know, should I respond to the questions that are there, or simply, because first point, this transactionalism, I believe is some sort of a normal thing in foreign affairs in general. If you think transactions are being made, you, in a way, entering EU, it was a transaction. You lift up democratic standards in Central Europe, and in exchange, you're entering the most prosperous and stable economic and political project on the continent. So was that the transaction? I think on transactionalism, then we would agree with what Péter said. Yes, I can see that in individual approach, this transactionalism as an individual, personal philosophy of particular individuals, like Viktor Orban. They don't do it for their country, they do it for themselves. I mean, it's connected transactionalism in that sort of sense, and also in respect to what Dan was saying, is strictly speaking corruption. It's basically taking profits for your own personal gain under the cover and pretext and with the tools of what today's sovereign country is, but with a damage to your own country. I mean, there is no doubt, there is no question that what Viktor Orban or Donald Trump or who we call transactionalists are doing are damaging interests of sovereign states. And sovereign states are there to protect human rights. They provide human rights, individual equality and liberties. So these guys are dangerous, but they're not doing transactions in the name of Hungary, or this is not Hungarian transactions. This is a particular guy who wanted to seal a deal and put some money in his pocket. And to put some money in his pocket, he needs to share with some other guys that help him stay in power. So if that's what we call transactionalism, we can call it also corruption simply, or stealing. You're stealing public money. So that point, on that point, we can say we leave it there. I still think it's much more chaotic. I do not see how we call it. How can we call it even foreign policy? This has influence, foreign and international influence, definitely, but it's not necessarily something stable, something that produces some sort of added value, added importance in a systemic way. It is much more of a situation when there is some fault, just like in the case of Facebook, we recently see the companies that are pressured because of the lack of transparency, ethical standards, public opinion pressure. They actually see that their brand and reputation may suffer, and because of that, they take action. And it's very similar situation, I believe, in, and again, in the history of many companies that invested somewhere else. They were pulling back, maybe with not so much effect on the politics, but the investors are also sensitive to pressure, but not the pressure, of course, in the country where they invest. Much more to the pressures in the countries where they have some constituency simply back at home. They're also sensitive too. Yeah, I think there might be some other questions, but I stop here.
Yes, thank you. I think this is a good moment for Péter to come back and maybe add his thoughts to Wojciech's remarks, but also to share the last bits of his ideas that were, unfortunately, because of the technical error, had to be left off. So Péter.
Yes, thank you. I will omit a lot of things from what I wanted to say. Probably it was good for the audience that I was excluded from the discussion for a while. And I would just come up with something, trivial, practical considerations about transactionalism, because I think transactionalism in this broader term, as I use that, which is not only is about, let's say, a trade-off in foreign policy, but also pulling aside the value-based component of the foreign policy, also favoring bilateralism and so on and so on. But it has one very practical consequence that you can change the behavior of a state if you think it's acting transactional, or a politician via good transactions. And I think we have quite a lot of bad practices around the world these days, and we can learn them. And I think one of the worst practices in that respect is the so-called principled engagement policy of the State Department that is the dominant line towards Hungary and a lot of other countries, of course. But just picking up Hungary, what we could see in the last, let's say, 2 years is a systemic ignorance of the, let's say, very openly expressed demands of the United States. Did the Central European University could totally stay in Budapest despite the criticism of the United States? No. Did Hungary make steps to normalize its relationship with Ukraine? Not so much. And the list goes on and on. Only since the beginning of the pandemic, we made a huge big deal with Huawei. There was an important decision on securing the Budapest-Belgrade railway line. We secured some long-term gas contracts with Russia. And what was the response from this side of the European, from the State Department? A friendly phone conversation between Donald Trump and Viktor Orban, that Viktor Orban could just put on its Facebook page and boasting about U.S.-Hungarian relations, the best ever. Also, after a lot of steps in which Hungary shifted eastwards, Orban received a gift of a meeting with Donald Trump at the White House. So I think transactionalism follows a quite simple logic. I mean, if your partner acts in a way that you don't want to, then you do not reward it, but rather, let's say, use the stick. And this is a very inverse relationship. And I think it's very bizarre that why the US, let's say, philosophy of the State Department and US foreign policy these days is expressed transactionalism in practice. They seem not to really apply it, because I think it would be probably not so difficult to apply it with a country of 10 million.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Fernan, we turn to you now. Where do you think this is taking the Philippines? Obviously, that's a very difficult question, but what would be your take on this? Has President Duterte seized enough control of democratic institutions? Has he diminished opposition, independent voices sufficiently to ensure his re-election? So in terms of an appetite, is there a limit? What do you think?
Well, for one, there's no re-election for Philippine presidents. The term of the presidency in the Philippines is for like 6 years. This changed in the 1980s after the dictatorship trauma among Filipinos. But however, there are signs that Duterte's camp has been testing the waters to determine who could succeed him. The opposition is currently in disarray, and joining the opposition equates to political suicide. Like this has been exhibited in the recent national elections, wherein 8 oppositional senatorial candidates, none of them won the elections. So most of the politicians who align with Duterte are somehow assured of a certain political stability. Like they can be certain that they can maintain their position and to that effect. But when we speak of independent voices, there still are resistance to what the government has been doing, but the government, I mean, the Duterte supporters, there is this what scholars recently call as the keyboard warriors, or Duterte's diehard supporters, you know, those kind of how to say, those kind of mechanisms of control online. There are instances that resistance can shut this troll and can shut down this other this governmental control being practiced by the supporters and the administration. But at the moment I don't see any possibilities, or I don't see I don't know. I mean, it's just kind of hard to describe now. So yeah.
And clearly, there's always a question of what can be done within a country, and how can international support bolster that, or how can that influence domestic processes. Without domestic processes, it would be very hard to create something out of the blue. But certainly, still, there's this overarching question. That what can be done at the international level to stop the backsliding, given the weakness of the European Union and the strength of China and Russia on this. Yesterday, in the opening panel of the conference, Rector Ignatieff said that the EU needed to get its house in order to increase its influence over the Visegrad Four specifically. So the question is, what would need to be done specifically for the European Union, maybe? How should this newly ordered house look like? But also in terms of the international global order. And the question is addressed to all of you. If, yes, I see Wojciech has his hand up. Is that, and also Dan. Wojciech first, maybe? No, please, Dan, then go on.
Okay. I'll just say a couple things quickly. Curious what everyone else has to say. But yeah, in terms of what the EU can do to get its house in order, I mean, I think there are a number of things. And I just start by saying, and I touch on this in my talk, but we should emphasize that it's not just the let's say the notable villains on the international stage who are enabling democratic backsliding. People like Trump, right? It's also some of the icons of democracy and leaders of the free world. So Merkel, right, is the leader of a party which has been the biggest enabler of democratic backsliding in Hungary, the CDU. She's never said a negative word in public about Orban and his backsliding, right? So it goes to the leaders of Europe have to take a stand, first of all, political stand. Then what actions concretely? Well, they need to pressure the EU to suspend funding of governments who attack democracy, the rule of law, and fundamental rights in the EU. That doesn't mean taking away the money forever. It can be put on hold until the behavior changes. As Péter says, it's a transaction, right? So you say, no, you can't have the funding, right, until you change course, right? And for now, they're just basically subsidizing backsliding. They need to stop that, number one. Politically, I think the parties, as I said, have these pet autocrats. They need to stop that. They need to have cordon sanitaire. These European level parties need to say autocrats or backsliding regimes have no place among democratic mainstream parties. They should kick them out, isolate them and shun them, and they can let them all join in a party of autocrats and just let them be labeled as such. And I think those two initial steps would go a long way to turning the tide.
If I may step in here, supporting all what Dan said, perhaps without pointing to concrete measures, because these measures may work, may not work, but things need to be done. But in order for things that need to be done to even start being implemented, there needs, I mean, within the European institutions, there is a need for like to shake things up and to have people who are there to realize that they are not administrators as they comfortably very often tend to think of themselves, simply because of the troubled regimes that we're talking about. They are there, which are actually it's discomforting perhaps that they, Viktor Orban or Kaczynski, whoever else, call EU institutions for what they actually should be, but they are not political or over-politicized, while they should be, according to the treaties, administrators. That this kind of shift in mentality, shift in strategic thinking, shift in basic principles needs to be changed there. We recently had a situation with watering down the report on China influence under COVID-19 in the EU institutions. So we are talking with people involved inside the Commission, and it turns out there is a lack of will and lack of principled mindset in the leadership, starting with Mr. Borrell and others, but it's not only about them, but in general, the leadership that is dealing with those things in the EU. I'm not saying all of the commissioners, but the key people who are dealing with foreign affairs, for instance, or who approach the state of foreign policy within the European Union. They think of themselves as administrators, someone who is not shaping politics, but in fact they are, even though they are kind of set on a mandate of administrating, you know, just liberal institutions means they do not have a democratic mandate. In fact, they are in a political game. They need to realize that. And if they do not behave like politicians, if they do not take political stand, meaning fight and conflict also, EU is going to fail. And their job is not to allow the EU to fail. So that basic thing needs to be changed within the mindset, within perhaps sometimes personal changes that need to be done in the EU in order for this instrument, which EU has existing instruments, to pinpoint countries which are not doing things right. We have the European Court of Justice. It just needs a will to do it. And that starts with thinking, and that starts with principled politicians that are in the EU institutions.
So this, you talk about principles and how they need to be enforced. And there's a question that maybe Péter can talk a little bit about, but I'm sure others will have views too. So how about the US? You know, when you look at the case of Hungary, for example, whether principled engagement has worked, or whether it hasn't worked, what has succeeded in influencing Mr. Orbán's government? A reset in US policy, would that lead to any changes, and what would that need to look like?
Yeah, I think this is a perfect question, not a very easy one. I do think, though, that if, let's say, this transactional approach in US foreign policy, that is, let's say, the official line would be taken seriously, it could be probably more efficient than the current one, which I think, let's say, chaos of many different approaches. And yes, I would agree with the question that there were real problems with the foreign policy of the Obama administration as well. For example, I think some of the priorities when dealing with this region were probably not always the most important ones, such as anti-Semitism, which is of course a problem in Central Eastern Europe, but probably is not among the primary problems. But let me come up with one good example from the time of the Obama administration, and it's an open story because even Barack Obama mentioned it in one of his speeches, which I think reveals the logic of efficient foreign policy. What happened was not a very important issue it was an erection of a statue of an anti-Semite called Bálint Hóman, who was a writer, historian, and then he participated in the Aerocross parliament as well. So he really not a nice guy. And Székesfehérvár wanted to erect a monument for them. And some US State Department officials came to town and walked around, and also went to Székesfehérvár and elsewhere, and they sent a message that, okay, you can raise that, but be aware that there will be no investments. So there were some planned investments that they told that they will just be withdrawn, and we will tell investors that probably cities and countries where there are monuments erected for open anti-Semites are not the perfect place for invest. And this next day, Orbán changed his mind. It's one of the few examples. It's not always this easy, of course, but it was one of the few examples. And of course, it's not a very important issue. They raised the price of a move, of a, let's say, authoritarian illiberal move, and it worked. But if you have a transactionalist logic, and you need to have, to a certain extent at least, in foreign policy, then you have to reward the good behavior and punish the bad behavior. What is going on right now in US foreign policy these days is that they reward authoritarianism, while authoritarianism in this region always comes hand in hand with increasing Chinese and Russian influence. So authoritarianism is a grave threat for US foreign policy interests, and there is no such a thing, I think, in this region, that let's ignore human rights issues, focus only on American interests. We can see how efficiently it works these days.
Thanks, Peter. One geographic region that is absolutely up for grabs, apparently, is right in our neighborhood here in the Balkans. It seems like transactionalism is clearly shaping the European Union's expansion policy towards the Balkans. This is a question from somebody in the audience. And he or she is asking that can the EU sustain a politics of transactionalism towards the region, or are Balkans doomed to a state of limbo? What would the members of this panel predict? And this is a future scenario a little bit.
So should we just speak on what the EU should do on the Balkans, or vis-a-vis Balkans?
Yes, please. I think it is really important. Yeah. And there is we've been discussing how the European Union, you've been saying that the European Union could, in fact, it does have tools, and it just needs principled and strong will to act. Is there something more that the EU should do to make sure that the Balkans region? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's actually on the table and it's being discussed. One of the proposals that emerged from France that otherwise was not very supportive on enlargement overall, and it's part. Essentially, if you hear into the Commission, this is part of the rethinking of future enlargement. Enlargement cannot be done as they used to. And enlargement needs to have, and any policy of enlargement usually has had, in the case of Visegrad countries, and later on perhaps less, this transformative power. And in order to reinvent this transformative power of enlargement, and therefore any approach to be it Western Balkans or Eastern Partnership, the EU is now thinking out of, to step out of the wholesale, all package, all boxed enlargement into gradualism, into gradual steps where the French proposal, Macron's proposal, was to begin with the rule of law, kind of have this sorted out, secured, then move to the next step, and then only after several steps, there are 6, I believe, that he proposed, never mind how many, but it's a different carrot and stick approach. Again, I mean, someone may call it transactionalism. Again, foreign policy is all about different quid pro quos, but it depends what do you trade. And I think this trading of values or expecting a real change and then general assessment is a good thing. It needs to be reinstated and needs to be refought, and that also means putting immediate enlargement on hold, not allowing for immediate, just go ahead with another territorial enlargement, but really a fundamental conditionality to be reinstated in the process. Then it will be helping for the EU overall as well.
Should I go ahead?
Yes.
Yeah, well, I think everything Wojciech said would be, those would be good steps. They're advisable. I know there are some of those shifts in principle, at least in the approach to enlargement. But I have to say, I'm much more pessimistic about where I see it going, the enlargement process and the EU's influence on the Balkans in the next few years. First of all, relating to this idea of autocratic regimes getting inside the EU, like Hungary or possibly Poland after the second round of the election, we'll see. Then maybe Polish democracy will be finished soon too. But point is that then once they're in, they use their position inside to infiltrate the institutions and pursue policies that make the EU even more safe for autocracy. So how does that relate to the Balkans? Well, in exchange for supporting von der Leyen becoming the Commission president, right? Orban got her to give him the enlargement portfolio to one of his cronies. So the enlargement commissioner is now Várhelyi, an Orban loyalist. So of course, he's not going to promote rule of law and democracy in the Balkans and the greater neighborhood of enlargement countries, because that's not what Orban wants to see. And this goes beyond just him. I mean, look, last week you had this rigged election which the opposition boycotted in Serbia. And then you had, I think it was Tusk, former president of the council, leader of the EPP, congratulating Vučić, Orban ally, on his election in Serbia. Well, I think that's what we have to see in the future is, those kind of phenomena. And more generally, what's the point of applying democratic conditions and rule of law conditions in the enlargement process since we've seen that as soon as you get in, you can backslide on all of that, right? So personally, while I was, I lived in Hungary in the 90s, I've always been a big backer of enlargement, but now I've come to believe enlargement has to be on hold indefinitely until the EU can show that it can defend democracy against backsliding.
Thank you. As we're drawing to a close, I would invite everybody on the panel to add maybe a last thought, either on this specific issue or something else that you feel you'd like to leave here for the audience. If Fernan, do you want to start? Very, very short closing remarks before we wrap up.
Well, I just want to end by saying that China is not necessarily it's not the direct cause of democratic backsliding in the Philippines, but presenting itself as an alternative source for military or diplomatic support. In that sense, we can say that China is enabling autocracies and liberal leadership in our region. So yeah, I think that's it for me.
Thank you. This is a really important thought, I think. Enablers of what? It can be enablers of good, enablers of strong democracies, but also the reverse. Péter, would you want to add a last thought before we go to Wojciech?
Yeah, I would just repeat myself with saying that I do think that the trap of this transactionalist approach from the West and pushing values in the background is that I think really there is no such a thing as pro-Western authoritarian regimes, or not too much in this region at all. And quite symbolically, we should take a look at what happened with Nikola Gruevski, who started his career with let's say the hopeful boy of the West, of the EU and of the United States, and he even met with George W. Bush and so on and so on, and it ended up his political career after getting very, very close to Russia and engaging into authoritarian practices such as wiretapping and so on and so on. And quite symbolically, he enjoys right now the hospitality of Budapest.
Wojciech?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we spoke so much about the international institutions, EU, and so on. I think, you know, in order to stop the basically exploitation of sovereign states by people who were appointed as their leaders, you don't get so much from international pressure. You need democratic resilience at home. You need to win elections, even if elections are rigid or unfairly conducted. That is really the game in town. Without that, you are not able to change the course of the country. That is both what is at stake and what needs to be done.
So I'll just say very quickly two things. I want to first just thank Márta, Ben, the CEU, the Shattuck Center for the invitation, and the panelists for this great discussion. And then I guess the last thought I have is just to say, you know, because everything I said was pessimistic and very grim sounding, but I just say, I think democracies are, you know, stronger than, you know, a lot of people realize. You know, if we could get together both the democracies, both from, you know, North America, Europe, and the rest of the world, democracies in Latin America, Asia, Africa. I mean, one thing Biden has called for is a summit of democracies if he's elected. And I think kind of democracies need to refine their solidarity and stand up to the autocratic forces pushing this alternative model around the world. So thanks.
Thank you. This is a very important message too. I think all of these last remarks really encapsulate the essence of a very rich discussion. And I also want to thank all of you for being here and sharing your thoughts. And I want to thank also the audience who have followed the session and who asked. There were a lot of questions, and I apologize if we didn't get to all of them. I tried hard, but it was a very rich discussion. And I would like to now, after saying goodbye and thank you, hand it over to Ben Batoche, who will round off.
I want to thank all of you for such a really very interesting, very timely, and an outstanding conversation. All of the presentations were absolutely fantastic, and we really appreciate it. And thank you all for taking the time to look at issues that you had already explored, but through a different lens. And that effort really showed, and we really appreciate it. So from the Shattuck Center, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. And I hope that you will all join us tomorrow for the final two sessions. At 2 p.m. Central European time, we'll talk about security implications of transactional foreign policy. And then at 4 p.m., our final session will focus on transactional foreign policy and the global response to COVID-19. So thanks again. And we hope that this conversation will continue offline. Thank you.